Greetings, viewers. Welcome to the third episode of the True Patriot podcast. On the 1st of July, 1999, Zimbabwe lost father to Zimbabwe, a man who dedicated all his adult life to fight for an independent Zimbabwe. I think Nkomo is one of the few liberation war heroes who fought and we were persecuted both in the build-up to independence and post-independence. Although he founded the struggle for the independence of Zimbabwe at the last part of it, he never got the opportunity to lead Zimbabwe. Now, when history is constructed, there is always a tendency to exclude the voices of those who do not get to power. So the narratives, when the narration of Zimbabwe is being done, the narration of the nation is being done, the role of people like Joshua Nkomo are easily excluded. But there's no doubt that Joshua Nkomo remains Father Zimbabwe. And after his death, there was consensus that is indeed he is Father Zimbabwe. Even attempts to try to erase his legacy failed because his legacy was enduring and is enduring. Today, we want to discuss Joshua Nkomo, his life, and then try to look into what Zimbabwe could have been under his leadership, and then try to explore what we think Joshua Nkomo could have instructed us to do today, given our challenges. We are guided by what Nkomo believed when we go to that last part, his ideology, among other things. To help me unpack this particular issue is the General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Communist Party, Comrade Nauto Mabena. Welcome, Comrade Mabena. You can go on and introduce yourself to the viewers. And as you introduce yourself, what do you think is the world's biggest challenge today, and how do you think the world can respond to it effectively?
Thank you so much, Comrade President. As you have said, that I'm the General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Communist Party. I also chair the Zimbabwe Community in South Africa. As we are recording this, I'm in Joburg, where
maybe I can't clearly hear you. Maybe if you could try to raise your voice. I'm not sure what's happening, but I'm hearing you. But maybe if you could get closer to the mic or something.
Thank you, Comrade President. I hope I'm audible enough. I'm saying I am, as you have already said, that I'm the General Secretary of the Zimbabwe Communist Party. I'm also chairing the Zimbabwe community in South Africa. I'm currently based in Johannesburg.
Yeah, thank you so much. So the story of Joshua Nkomo is one which has been twisted by those who were in power at some point. But we want to really go back and look at his role in the build-up to our independence, his role in liberating Zimbabwe. From your own perspective, we understand Nkomo was a trade unionist. He was immersed in religion. He had positions on ethnicity. We want to appreciate his ideological grounding and other things. Of course, we can't do justice to this big story in one podcast, but just a summary from your perspective on the role that Joshua Nkomo played towards the liberation of this great country.
The late Dr. Joshua Nkomo was a nationalist. He was influenced largely by the African National Congress. We recall that he came to South Africa, where he went to Durban to further his studies, where when he was in South Africa, he met with then South African President Nelson Mandela. It is these comrades that influenced Comrade Joshua Nkomo to take part in the liberation of the country. Of course, he was a trade unionist, as we have said. He was leading the biggest trade union in Zimbabwe. We also know that the National Railways was the first to have its employees going on strike in 1912. Though, of course, in 1912, Nkomo was not born, but he built on what our trade unionists had already started in trying to raise class consciousness amongst the working class. So when Nkomo went back to Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, after his studies in South Africa, he was asked to join the liberation movement when he was leading in the trade union at the Rhodesian railways. So he became from the trade union movement a nationalist. He did not see Zimbabwe in the ethnic lenses. Of course, we must underline that Dr. Joshua Nkomo, he was not a communist. It's important to state that he was not a communist, though, of course, ZAPU was largely supported by communists. He made contacts with the Soviet Union and the other socialist blocs. ZIPRA was being funded and trained by communists. But when he started, he was not a communist. Just like Fidel Castro, when he started Fidel Castro, the liberation struggle, the Cuban Revolution, he was not a communist. Only his brother, Raul Castro, was a communist. So ZAP itself, even though it was receiving funding, it was receiving support from the communist parties and the socialist bloc countries, it only adopted socialism as an ideology in 1978. So, but indeed, Nkomo was a nationalist. He dedicated his life to the struggle of the people of Zimbabwe. He wanted to see the liberation of Zimbabwe, but the liberation of Black people in the African continent. This is why he had to work with other liberation movements across the continent.
Okay, thank you so much for that. But there are some people who say at some point Nkomo is accused during the Liberation War of derailing the struggle. One, there are at least two moments where he negotiated settlements that were rejected by some of his comrades internally, including an election. And then there are accusations that he would spend more of his time globetrotting, neglecting the struggle at home, and he was hesitant to use the route of an armed struggle to settle the question of liberating Zimbabwe. What would be your response from what you understand on that?
Well, that would not be accurate in that ZIPRA, even though it was not known as ZIPRA, Dr. Nkomo was the first leader to send comrades for training in Algeria and in other countries as early as the 60s. That we had people that went for training, military training. But as you know, the struggle for national liberation, when it started, the idea was not to engage militarily. Just like the African National Congress, when it was established in 1912, it did not think that it was going to engage militarily against the white minority rule in South Africa, just as the Communist Party of South Africa then, as established in 1921, it did not think that it was going to engage militarily in the struggle. So what you heard was that nationalists initially wanted to negotiate with the white minority rule to say you must allow blacks to have a say in the running of the country. So they thought that they were going to put pressure, persuading the white minority regime and its supporters to accept that the reality was the majority needed to participate in the political processes in the country. It was then when they realized that the white minority rulers were not prepared to negotiate. The only language that they understood was the barrel of a gun. This is why, even in South Africa, after the ANC having been formed in 1912, it was in 1961 that Umkhonto Wesizwe, the military wing of the African National Congress, was established. Following that, it was then that Dr. Nkomo sent in the early 60s people to be trained in Algeria and in other countries. So it will not be correct to say that Dr. Joshua Nkomo did not want to engage militarily. He first and foremost wanted to negotiate When negotiations failed, he embarked on an armed struggle.
Okay, then maybe to the question to say, at some point in 1978, the Zupra forces managed to gun down 2 Rhodesian planes. And I think from the writings of, I think it is Chigwedere, who then says they became the most wanted men on the list of the Rhodesian forces. They wanted to assassinate him. And then there was a choice was already made then to say ZANU would be the preferred leadership ahead of the likes of Joshua Nkomo and others. From where you sit, because do you think that the emergence of the ZANU PF party as victors post the liberation struggle had to do with a continuation, the objective of sustaining a neo-colonial state on the behalf of the imperialist forces? It was a choice, or ZANU-PF managed to mobilize ahead of ZAPU. What would be your take on that?
We must understand firstly that in 1963, because ZAPU at that time was in a relationship with the Soviet Union, Cuba, and the others, and it was during the Cold War. So the imperialists obviously did not want the influence of the Soviet Union in this part of Africa. So they had to split the liberation movement. You can start even within the African National Congress itself in 1958, when the PAC split from the ANC, because the PAC, its attitude was that you did not need white people or white comrades within the national liberation movement, in this case, the African National Congress. But we know that the PAC, ZANU, and others, UNITA and others, they formed their own alliance. And at the time, being supported by President Nyerere and supported by China, because you recall that there was a Soviet-Sino conflict in terms of the different approach on the question of Marxism or the Marxism. And China at the time was not really a power as it is today. So when the elections were about to happen in 1979, Dr. Joshua Nkomo wanted the Patriotic Front to contest the elections. Patriotic Front meaning ZANU, ZAPU coming together as different movement to contest the elections. But of course, because the imperialist forces saw ZANU as a better devil than ZAPU of land, which ZAPU was very clear in its policy in terms of how land was going to be dealt with. Secondly, the imperialists were not happy with the relationship between ZAPU, the ANC, and the rest of the socialist countries. Thirdly, what you have mentioned, that the downing of the plane. Dr. Nkomo spoke about that, that it was an intelligence that went wrong, because the idea was not to expose civilians to any danger. This is even shown in the manner in which ZIPRA executed the war, because ZIPRA did not gather people in night meetings, exposing them to the enemy. So in their understanding, in terms of the intelligence that they received, that plane was not carrying civilians. There was a target who was supposed to be in that plane, hence the downing of that plane. But of course, it then went wrong. So the policy of ZIPRA as a military wing of ZAPU under the leadership of Dr. Joshua Nkomo was not to expose civilians to the enemy.
Thank you so much. And then we then get to then say we can't really downplay ZANU-PF's victory at 1980. Some would say they deserved it. They were operating along the Mozambique border, where they had more access to the populous Manica and Mashona lands. They were engaged in more of political mobilization than military action, dismantling structures of ZAPU, among other things. What would you say about the 1980 election yourself? Was it a free and fair contest? And ZANU-PF won because of these tactics and strategies?
The 1980 election, according to the story of my life, written by Dr. Joshua Nkomo, it was not free and fair because after the Lancaster House Agreement, when it was resolved or agreed that Zipra and Zanla were going to be placed in assembly points, Zanla did not go to assembly points. What they did, they spent the time, as we are saying, mobilizing people, grassroots people in Manica land, Mashona land, and parts of Maswingo. And this mobilization, it was not only political mobilization, it was militarily. Many people were killed in Manica land who were ZAPU supporters. Many people were killed in Mashona land. So they instilled fear. Dr. Nkomo, in his book, he says he approached Lord Soames, who was governor, about the violence, and even suggested that ZANU-PF, because it had violated the code of conduct in the holding of elections, wanted ZANU-PF to be banned. But of course, Lord Soames was reluctant and they wanted to return to London. He did not ban ZANU. And because ZANDA had now created a no-go area in those provinces, making difficult for other political parties to campaign, something that we saw with the emergence of the MDC when ZANU mobilized war veterans again to create a no-go area for the MDC and the other political parties. So people voted for ZANU in the majority, not because they believed in ZANU, but because they had seen what was happening to people that were opposed to ZANU-PF.
Yeah, thanks so much for clarifying that, because that story is hardly told. The independence elections at 1980 is celebrated as if it was a free and fair election, which marked the establishment for a constitutional democracy where one man, one vote became a reality. But from your explanation, it means that was not the real case. So, but now we look at the conflict that then ensues post-independence. We understand that when obviously called by speaking to his wife after losing the election, Dr. Nkomo himself, from what Musipa writes, he says he was calling his wife because he was very bitter with the outcome. He thought Zimbabweans had not thanked him enough for all that he had done during the liberation struggle. It was only consoled by Mama Mafiana, who was celebrating the victory of the Patriotic Front and victory of one man, one vote. But do you think the conflict that then ensues post-independence had anything to do with the bitterness on the part of the ZAPU leadership? What is your analysis of the post-war independence conflict, the genocide that then comes in, according to the CCJP? 20,000 people were killed in Matabele, mainly those who were supporting ZAPU and members of ZIPRA. The narratives that were taught then, even what we were taught in school, was that they were targeting dissidents in Matabele. That is the story that we were taught. But I want you to get an understanding from you about the post-1980 conflict and the genocide, which led to the mass killing of our people.
First, we need to underline, President, that there is no conflict post the 1980. What we had was a genocide, because if we say there was a conflict, we are then saying that there was a civil war in Zimbabwe. There was no civil war in Zimbabwe. Dr. Joshua Nkomo, like many ZAPU supporters and ZAPU leaders, indeed were disappointed that they lost elections, that any politician that participates in an election, loses an election, gets disappointed. They accepted the outcome. They were invited in the government of national unity as led by ZANU-PF in 1980. They took up their positions in government and began to do what they were asked to do. But as soon as that government was constituted, then Prime Minister Robert Mugabe, in of Joyce Mujuru and others, went to North Korea to sign a military agreement. and we all know that that military agreement was about the creation of the 50th Brigade, which we then saw later on committing a genocide. The question that must be asked is, why did soon after independence in 1980, did Mugabe and the leadership of ZANU-PF see it important to enter into a military agreement when the country was putting together the National Army, bringing together three armies, the Rhodesian Army, the Zipra Army, the Zanda Army, constituting it into one Zimbabwe National Army? What was necessary to then approach North Korea? So we cannot therefore not say it was a conflict. It was planned that once you have this government of national unity, once ZANU-PF is in power, the only way to form or to establish a one-party state in Zimbabwe is by using military power to cow ZAPU and its leaders to agree to a one-party state in Zimbabwe. That was the purpose. Then what we then saw playing itself out, because in 1980, ZAPU had won most of its seats in Matabeleland and parts of Midlands. So now they were targeting the support base of ZAPU, which then unfortunately, because the support base as seen in the outcome of the 1980 elections was of Ndebele ethnic group, it is therefore interpreted that it was about the cleansing of the Ndebele speaking. But the reality is ZANU-PF wanted to establish a one-party state. For it to establish a one-party state, they needed to dismantle the ZAPU support base, as they did in Manicaland, as they did in Mashonaland, and creating a no-go area up to the elections in 1980.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Indeed, what happened then is unforgivable. But now we get to a point where the people in Matabeleland, the people in Midlands, they resisted whatever ZANU-PF threw at them. The next election again, with all the killings that were going on, they stood firm, or they voted ZAPU. They never wavered. They never changed their position, even with the massive campaigns, the propaganda, the killings, and everything. They remained solid. Someone would say that the capitulation of the leadership of Joshua Nkomo in 1987 betrayed those people who had remained solid for all those years, who were so prepared to defend their party, ZAPU, to defend what they believed in. And if the ZAPU party had remained outside the armpits of ZANU-PF, maybe our democracy stood a chance of maturing because of the resilience of the people of Midlands and Matabeleland.
What was clear was that in 1980, ZAPU was reduced into a regional party, as was the case in 1985. So a regional party that has no political power cannot change anything in Zimbabwe. So Dr. Nkomo understood that even if it does not sign the unit accord, there was no way that he was going to stop the killings, because he was not in charge of the Zimbabwean state, because it was the state that was committing a genocide against the Africans, in this case, the people of Matabeleland and Midlands. So the only way to stop the genocide, in his well-considered view, was to enter into a unit accord with the ZANU-PF, which some, as you call it, capitulation to ZANU-PF or others, ZAPU being swallowed. But he understood it as a way of stopping the killings. Of course, the people of Matabeleland, when ZAPU joined the unit accord, they only voted for ZANU-PF in 1995-1996 elections, of course, 1990 elections. But with the emergence of the MDC, it is the people of Matabeleland in 2000 that the rural Matabeleland and parts of Midlands voted for the MDC. And of course, the working class or voters in the working class communities did vote for the MDC. Only the rural communities in Mashonaland voted for ZANU-PF, and we know the reasons and the role that was played by the war veterans in creating go-no areas for the people in rural Mashonaland and Masungo provinces.
So sorry for that. The last part we heard was only the voters from. Then I think we lost connection there. Sorry, if you could take it from where we are speaking about voting.
Okay, I'm saying Dr. Nkomo signs the Unity Accord. The people of Matebeleland voted for ZANU-PF in 1990 because there was no alternative 1995, 1996. But in 2000, when an alternative was established, the Movement for Democratic Change, rural people in Matebeleland voted for the MDC, rejecting ZANU-PF. In rural Mashonaland, in rural Maswing, they voted for ZANU-PF, not because they loved ZANU-PF, but because they could not resist the violence which was thrown at them by the war veterans who created a no-go area. In Matebeleland, because of the experience in 1985, to say, even if we are voting under the guns, we will vote for the part of our choice. So in 2000, the people of rural Matebeleland said, even if you deploy war veterans in rural Matebeleland, we have decided that you are going to vote for the MDC. But that was not the case in rural Mashonaland. So we cannot safely say that ZANU-PF won rural Mashonaland, rural Manicaland, rural Maswingo because people loved ZANU-PF. They won because people were intimidated, people were killed. ZANU-PF was using violence to coerce people to vote for it.
Okay, thank you so much. Then we go to the question to say, let's imagine that Nkomo was leading Zimbabwe, but he had the background of being supported by the USSR during the fight of the liberation struggle. And we understand the Cold War dynamics. The early years of our independence again still at it. We understand that the bulk of the investment in social services, in education, healthcare, that we got in the early years, we were done through maybe support with grants from the West mainly, some of course which we lost to corruption among other things. Can you attempt to share what would Zimbabwe have become if Nkomo had won the first years of independence, 1980 to 1990, before the collapse of the USSR? How you imagine how you could have navigated that particular Cold War era to make sure that there was economic progress in Zimbabwe?
Dr. Nkomo was going to do what former President Nelson Mandela did. He was going to pursue reconciliation with the white Zimbabweans, former Rhodesians. He was going to appeal to them to remain in the country. As I said earlier on, that ZAPU was not a socialist political formation. It was a national liberation movement. They were not going to introduce socialism, or were not going to transit to socialist Zimbabwe. That was not going to happen. So it was going to try to ensure that there's unity in the country, because ZAPU in its literature said that it was not fighting a racial war, but it was fighting a war so that every Zimbabwean can feel accommodated. So it was going, government was going to pursue the policy of reconciliation in the first 10 years and ensure that those that were running the economy remained running the economy. But of course, we saw what he did with the ZIPRA when they contributed money and they bought properties. So it was going to ensure that young people were going to establish cooperatives as part of bringing Black people into the mainstream economy. So this is what ZAP was going to do. And of course, distribute land fairly, which we have challenges in the first decade of our independence because of the Lancaster's constitution or agreement. But going forward, we think that land reform was going to be distributed in a manner that was not going to see white commercial farmers living in Zimbabwe.
Okay, great. So from your submissions, policies like the Economic Structural Adjustment Program those were usually imposed on countries on the periphery of capitalism by the West, by the imperialist forces, structural adjustment programs. And in the early 90s, our economy in Zimbabwe was crippled because we adopted ISAP, which led to massive loss of job losses. And I think up to date, we're still feeling the effects of how structurally we were weakened by ISAP. I am again trying to look from the angle where, because we can't be asking him Nkomo, but we always read literature around his beliefs and his values, his view of the world. How do you think maybe Nkomo would have navigated such the era of structural adjustment programs?
It's important to note that in this struggle, Zimbabwe was funded by capitalists as well. While it had a relationship with the Soviet Union, but mining companies like Lonzo, led by Tiny Rollins, were supporting ZAPU. So they were going to influence the economic policy of ZAPU as they are influencing the economic policy of the African National Congress. So ZAPU was going to behave like any other liberation movement that we have seen, the ANC, SWAPO, and the other liberation movements. But maybe the difference might have been the degree. Corruption was going to be there. Let's not rule that one out. Corruption was going to be there. Maybe it was going to be a question of the degree of corruption. But in a capitalist economy, corruption is always there. So that's what I think was going to happen. The other challenge, of course, with the Dr. Nkomo was that he became the leader of the liberation movement as way back around 1957, and he went to Unity Accord still as the leader of the liberation movement. That is, in this case, there's no history of a question of secession within ZAPU itself. So again, we might have ran into problems in terms of the question of secession in Zimbabwe if he was a prime minister or head of state and government, as we saw with Sam Nujoma, who amended the constitution after his 2 terms to run for a 3rd term. We do not know if he was going to do a Mandela. The reason, of course, why we saw Mandela taking the route which he took in terms of only serving the 1st term as the president is because inside the ANC, they began to understand the importance of secession politics, something which was not there in ZAPU. So one would speculate and say whether under his leadership term limits were going to be introduced or not, it would be speculation.
Okay, now we go to the issue of a multi-party democracy. I think you've touched on it a bit, maybe just to give more detail. We understand that as soon as we now had a popular opposition in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF engaged in massive violence, serious knee-jerk economic responses, for example, the police responses, the land question, the war veterans issue, among other things. What do you think that Dr. Nkomo would have handled the idea of an opposition differently? How did Nkomo handle opposition when in the past?
He might not have used the military or state security to deal with the opposition, but he, of course, one would speculate that he was going to be disappointed. He was going to see it as betrayal in that you are building a new state. You have just ushered in democracy. Then you have opposition parties that are emerging. He might not use the military to deal with them because we understand that he rejected the one-party state principle under ZANU when Mugabe was pursuing a one-party state system. So he would have, just like the African National Congress, allowed the political parties to flourish. But he was going to be more on the side of the people to an extent that the opposition parties were not going to get massive support from the electorate.
Thank you. So maybe we can now go to the situation now. And I think this segment, we just want to call it the what is to be done. And my questions really are premised, inspired by an article written. It was a lecture by Dr. Sipo Malunga. I think he presented it in 2020, where he comes up with 4 themes of things that he thinks if Nkomo would have addressed the unfinished business of the liberation struggle from where he sits. He said then about the constitutional democracy, the issue of tribalism and exclusion, the issue of gender, and then the issue of economic progress. And I think these are valid areas where we still feel the liberation struggle remains incomplete on those 4 facets. Now, I'll begin with a section of the economic progress and the livelihoods of our people. We have seen how corruption have destroyed the livelihoods. We have seen how neoliberalism has made our people poor. We have seen how general mismanagement of resources, incompetence, greed is created unemployment of our people, poverty. With cutting of funding for social services, our people can't afford education. With 3 million learners out of school, we can't have access to health care. Going forward, assuming that we want to get you there to say, what would you prescribe for Zimbabwe to be able to deal with this? Of course, if you can draw any inspiration from Joshua Nkomo, you can share, but we will understand your own views from your own ideological standpoint. How can Zimbabwe deal with the current crisis?
Our liberation is not complete. The first task that we need to do is to complete our liberation. We need to dismantle the neo-colonial state. I have no doubt in my mind that if Dr. Nkomo became the leader of Zimbabwe, we were still going to be under a neo-colonial state because, as I've already said, that he had the relationships just like the African Congress with the capitalistic class. And of course, Dr. Joshua Nkomo was a businessman himself. He ran businesses in Zimbabwe. There's no doubt about that. So we were going to continue under a neo-colonial state. So what we need is to complete the liberation of Zimbabwe, place the economy in the hands of the majority as a whole. We need, of course, a leadership that respects the constitution of Zimbabwe. Yes, I have no doubt that Dr. Nkomo would have respected the constitution, but I'm not sure, as I've said, in the question of secession, whether Dr. Joshua Nkomo was going to allow himself to step down that much and give to others to speculate on it. But in terms of promoting oneness as the people of Zimbabwe dealing with the question of tribalism, he was going to take the same line that the African National Congress has taken, because in the ANC, you cannot say this person, the vendor is a Xhosa. They regard themselves as South Africans. And this is what Dr. Joshua Nkomo was going to pursue. What we need to do ourselves, if we are to keep the memory of Dr. Joshua Nkomo, is to shun tribalism, is to deal with the question of ethnicity, is to unite the people of Zimbabwe across the board, because we should not view each other through ethnic lenses. You are of Shona origin, I'm of Ndebele origin. I should not view you as a Shona, you should not view me as a Ndebele, but as Zimbabweans, whose task or our task is to complete our liberation, build an economy that will serve the people of Zimbabwe with and the tide on the question of migration, where young people are now leaving the country in droves, where workers in Zimbabwe are slaves, are being paid slave wages. So these are the things that we must address. And Dr. Joshua Nkomo, as a trade unionist, of course, we must draw inspiration from that. that as a trade unionist, he wanted better wages for the workers, he wanted better working conditions for the workers, and this is what we must do as the new generation.
Now there is this big talk in our politics where people say, no, we lose an election like 2023, maybe the election was rigged, the report, the election has been rigged. But the popular opposition leadership said we need to pray about it. God is in it. We have to wait for God. How do you view religion vis-a-vis politics? How do we handle it? Because we have a big section of our community which is tended to give up fighting and subcontracted God the task of addressing the fundamental questions of the day. What is your attitude on that question?
First, we must respect, as Dr. Nkomo did, respect one's religion. Dr. Nkomo did work with those of Christian faith. Dr. Nkomo worked with those of African spirituality. Dr. Joshua Nkomo worked with other different faith people in ZAPU and in the broader society. At the same Bible that our brothers speaks to says faith without works is dead. So what is critical is that while we might not want to dismiss their prayer, but they know that if you pray and you do not work up and work to achieve your goal, you will achieve nothing. If you are unemployed or if you are a student, if you cannot study and depend on prayer, you are going to fail your exam. If you are unemployed, you don't work up and look for a job, you will not get a job. So you must combine. This is why, as communists, we say theory and practice go hand in hand. So we will understand them if they are saying prayer and the political work in community go hand in hand. But you cannot disarm people to say, let us pray, let us wait at a particular place, placing people in some kind of a bus stop, if you like, and say, we must simply pray, then an answer is going to come from heaven, from a manna. That's nonsensical in our view. We respect prayer, we respect those that pray, but the prayer must be accompanied by practical work. Practical work requires us to go to communities, mobilize communities, raise their class consciousness, confront the regime, so that we will resolve the political and the economic, social challenges or crises that we have. It is then that we have achieved that indeed our prayer did work. But we cannot disarm people and say, we must fast, we must pray, but we do not mobilize our society. That, in our view, is out of order.
Now we go to the question you raised earlier on about the neo-colonial state, but this state is now also seriously captured by the ZANU-PF political party. We've seen how state institutions are abused. Just today, a journalist, Faith Zaba, the editor of the Zimbabwe Independent, was denied bail. State institutions are now being used to persecute our people. The elections are manipulated by these same state institutions. And most likely we may go to an election or no election because there are some people with 2030 ambitions or even want to completely do away with the term limits. How do we deal with the issue of reforming or freeing the state institutions from ZANU-PF? There have been a lot of talk about institutions reforms. Obviously, that has failed completely. And this is a talk that has been going on over a period of time. And we seem to be continuously sleepwalking into rigged elections, and they get rigged by the same state institutions. What would be a prescribed way forward, given that our institutions are now under the armpits of ZANU-PF?
There are two ways in our view. The first, which we do not doubt, is that it's critical that we mobilize the mass of the people, raise their class consciousness. Once that has been achieved, building unity in our communities, once we come together as a unity and clearly understanding the nature of our striking, ZANU-PF cannot survive. Because if we resolve that we are going to occupy the streets, even if the army comes with their guns, if the people are committed and they understand that, yes, some of us might lose our lives, some of us might be arrested, they will come to a point where even the very soldiers will not want to commit a genocide, not want to commit murder. The second aspect that we need to pursue is to engage, particularly the military, to win over the military. Of course, this one is difficult, but what we know, all of us, is that it is only the political elite that is benefiting, whether the political elite, the elite in the military, in the political class, that is benefiting. But the entire membership of ZANU-PF does not benefit, because this entire membership of ZANU-PF buys from the same supermarkets where we buy our groceries. They send their children to the same schools where we send ours. They go to the same clinics that have no medication like ours. So it is a question of dealing with the ZANU-PF propaganda. It is unfortunate that the MDC CCC could not respond to the propaganda when it was labeled as a project of the imperialist forces. So it is critical that we must contest the ZANU-PF ideologically, because we argue a true Pan-Africanist cannot commit a genocide. A true Pan-Africanist cannot steal from the people that they came to represent.
Thank you so much. Just as we close, Nkomo once said, "This country will never die. The young people will save it." I think that's a popular statement from Nkomo, among others. As we close down, what can be your message to the young people of Zimbabwe, and your final message to Zimbabweans in general, given the corruption that we're enduring, given the possibility of the suspension, the illegal suspension of 2028 elections, given what we have already discussed, the capture of our state institutions, the poverty, the inequality, among others. Just your final message to the people of Zimbabwe.
We, as young people in Zimbabwe, we should not allow ourselves to be divided along ethnic lines. That's the first critical point that we must raise. Secondly, we must unite around a common agenda. And the common agenda is to place our economy in the hands of the people. The lives of Dr. Joshua Nkomo and his generation did fight, engage in a struggle to dismantle neo-colonialism. Unfortunately, 18 April 1980 ushered in a neo-colonial state. We must, as the new generation, dismantle a neo-colonial state and drive out the influence of imperialism in our country, Zimbabwe. If we achieve that, then Zimbabwe will rise and become a great country.
Thank you so much for coming through for this conversation, which was a powerful conversation indeed. We stand at a point where Joshua Nkomo's struggle should inspire us as a generation to complete the task of liberating Zimbabwe. Thanks, viewers, for participating, for viewing this particular discourse. You can share your responses, and we can be able to respond to them in the next podcast. But thank you so much, Komina. And we've come to the end of the podcast.
Ndikuchema